Hey guys, before we get into this video, I want to thank you all for 50 subs. I honestly really appreciate that. And I also cracked my Pixel, so that's really cool. But yeah, we'll get right into this video. There's my dogs. But yeah, let's get into the iPod Touch 4 in 2020. The iPod Touch 4th generation was initially released back in 2010, featuring 8, 32, and 64 gigabytes of internal storage. This was released alongside the iPhone 4. The iPod was later updated in 2011, with only a white model being added and no other significant changes. In 2012, the iPod was lowered down to just $99, which is arguably a good or bad deal depending on if you wanted software updates or not, because it wouldn't get any more past that. It was also given a base of 16 gigs instead of 8 and an upgrade of 32 for $199. Now looking at the build, as you can see, the iPod Touch 4 is definitely a bit thinner than the iPhone 4, as well as the iPhone 4 is a good bit taller than the iPod Touch 4. On the back though, they're pretty similar with the logo as well as the camera, and then iPod versus iPhone. However, just holding it in your hand, you can tell easily that the iPod Touch 4 is just a lot lighter and just generally feels better because it conforms to your hand versus the blocky build of the iPhone 4. However, the build isn't the best in a sense because you have those plastic buttons as well as that mirrored finish, which Apple should have done away with long before this was released. However, the best part of the iPod Touch 4 easily is that display. It's 640 by 960, and while it isn't an IPS display, which means the viewing angles aren't great, this display is still pretty good even today. On the bottom of the iPod Touch 4, you get your standard headphone jack, which is always a nice feature to have. You get the 30-pin connector, which is getting kind of outdated, but you can still find a good amount of accessories for it. As well as you get your loudspeaker, which isn't great, but for listening to a song or two, it's not too bad. So yeah, overall the iPod Touch 4 is built pretty well. It's got that stainless steel back, which will definitely protect it during drops, but definitely not against scratches because it scratches insanely easy. But I also like that it's really thin. When it comes into actually using the iPod Touch 4 though, it's definitely more of a mixed bag. I mean, all your system apps are going to work just fine. You're going to be able to kind of do all the standard stuff. But obviously when it comes to like third-party apps and stuff, not many are going to work, especially considering how outdated the software is. The iPod Touch 4th generation runs anywhere from iOS 4.1 to iOS 6.1.6. On iOS 5, which my version is on, it runs pretty well. I've used it on iOS 6 before, and it's more buggy and often gets a lot hotter doing simple tasks. I find it very weird that just one iOS makes such a big difference. iOS 5 runs very well on this device, however app support is more limited. Speaking of app support, get used to seeing this message if you want to use one of these. It's going to happen quite a lot. Most apps will either just tell you they're out of date or that they're just straight up incompatible, like SoundCloud. Not only that, but it takes a very long time to open apps like the App Store. Was about 8 seconds. And that's kind of where you sadly hit your limits with the iPod Touch 4th generation. Most first-party apps will work just fine, however, once you go into the world of third-party apps, nearly nothing works. Therefore, the only reason you could really use this for is a music player. The rear-facing camera on the iPod Touch 4th generation is 0.7 megapixels and can shoot in 720p video, or what Apple calls it. The video quality is not very good. The front camera is 0.3 megapixels and shoots in VGA quality. And oh yes, battery life. Now, how is the battery life on the iPod Touch 4th generation? Well, okay. At least it was when it was brand new, but the problem is most of the iPod Touch 4th generations you can get used are going to have very degraded batteries, which means that this battery won't last that long. It was small to begin with, and it's going to be even worse now. Mine luckily wasn't used very much, so my battery is still pretty good on my iPod Touch. So we've kind of already established most of the iPod Touch 4, but what's my final thoughts? Well, the camera sucks, the battery sucks, and the app support sucks. But there's still a few things you can use these for if you happen to have one. You can still send messages on it, you can still send emails on it, and you can still listen to music just fine and play a few games if you can find them in the App Store. Now, there are not many, but there are a few that still will run. And should you buy one? No, you shouldn't. You should not buy one of these, and the reason is quite simple. You can't do much with it. Music is moving more towards streaming nowadays anyway, and they're still $20 to $30. Not only that, but they also have quite a few problems, such as cracked screens, broken home buttons, and power buttons. So if you do want to buy one, avoid those problems. Also avoid the 8GB model like it's the plague, because you will run out of storage very quickly by downloading a few songs. And the iPod Touch 4 will eventually become a piece of Apple's history as music moves more towards streaming and this device gets less and less app support each year. But it is still a very important piece of Apple's history and where Apple is today.